Hi, everybody. Brad Truex here from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. Today, we're going to talk about caterpillars, butterflies, and moths. For some time, we've been hoping to do a presentation on caterpillars, and you really can't do a presentation on caterpillars without talking about butterflies and moths. So here goes. Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths are members of the order Lepidoptera. And worldwide, there are over 17,000 species of butterflies and a whopping 160,000 species of moths. The reason for this is that moths evolved before butterflies, so they've had a lot more time to diversify and create many more species. And caterpillars, of course, are the larvae of butterflies and moths. And here in New Hampshire, there are probably 4,000 to 5,000 species of caterpillars, and they come in all sizes, shapes, and colors. So, why are caterpillars, butterflies, and moths important? Well, they're really crucial to the ecosystem. Butterflies and moths collectively provide a wide range of environmental benefits. The caterpillars are an extremely important element of the food chain. They're an important food source for birds, bats, mammals, other insectivorous animals, and even humans. uh, Areas that are rich in butterflies and moths are also rich in other invertebrates. And the butterflies and moths are pollinators, so they're extremely important for both plant abundance and plant diversity. And some caterpillars feed on harmful pests like aphids. And caterpillars are also important silk producers. And overall, they're really good indicators of a healthy environment and a healthy ecosystem. So again, we're often asked, what's the difference between a butterfly and a moth? Well, butterfly wings are usually brightly colored, and a butterfly typically holds the wings together vertically above its head when it's resting. On the other hand, the wings of a moth typically are duller in color. Now, that's not always the case, but usually they're duller in color, and their wings are held in a tent-like fashion over their abdomen when they're at rest. So that's the biggest difference. Now, when they're flying, also the wings of the moth beat much more rapidly than those of the butterfly. Butterflies also have thin, straight, long antennae with club-like tips, and I'll show you a picture of that, whereas moths have more of a feathery, thick, comb-like end to their antennae. And again, butterflies are more often seen during the daytime, whereas most moths are only seen at night. So again, here's those wings. So on the top, you have a butterfly, and once again, you have very colorful wings. And when the butterfly is sitting at rest, they're held upright, kind of vertically above the body. Whereas on the bottom, a moth typically has much duller wings, and the wings are tented over the body. So that's pretty easy to make a distinction between a butterfly and moth on that basis. Here is showing the antennae. Okay, so again, here you have these long, straight antennae with kind of a little ball on top on the butterfly. And on the other hand, in a moth, you get kind of a feathery shape to the antennae. So again, caterpillars are obviously the larval stage of butterflies and moths, and they eat mostly plant materials like leaves. And they're extremely important, not only because they turn into those butterflies and moths that are pollinators, but most importantly, they're an important part of the food chain. Many birds rely on caterpillars for their young. Caterpillars are really the ideal food source for hatchling birds, and that's because they're soft, they're high in protein, and they're high in lipid. So really, they're almost the ideal food. And the caterpillars eat leaves one cell at a time, and they're actually the primary way that the structure of leaves gets converted to energy that subsequently gets propagated widely via the food chain. And unlike caterpillars, the adult butterflies and moths eat mostly flower nectar. Okay, I mentioned before there are over 160,000 species of caterpillars worldwide, but they have the same basic body design. They have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. And the body is long and tubular. usually with a large head, a small thorax, and six true legs, and a 10-segment abdomen, and usually a large gut as well. Most have a pair of thick, fleshy prolegs on on the abdominal segments, and these are actually the ones that allow the caterpillar to move around. And they breathe through tiny pores on their sides. These are called spicules, and they also have six eyes on their sides. They have scissors-like jaws, which allow them to snip off and grind pieces of food, typically leaves and plants. And they have short antennas on each side of the mouth. And they have modified salivary glands that actually produce silk. And they have lots of hair-like structures called setae. In fact, the name caterpillar is actually derived from the Latin for hairy cat. Okay, so those hair-like structures are rather typical of many caterpillars. So here's typical caterpillar anatomy. Over here, you have a head, then you have a thorax, and then you have a longer abdomen. And there are some true legs up here on the thorax side, but then you have these things called prolegs, which really are the ones that help the caterpillar move. So metamorphosis, caterpillars transform into butterflies and moths. And the vast majority of caterpillars are moth larvae. And that's because there's so many more moths than there are butterflies. Actually, only about 12% of caterpillars are butterfly larvae. Caterpillars are voracious eaters and they grow very rapidly. As the caterpillar grows, it molts, meaning it gets rid of its skin and develops a new skin. And most of them go through 5 stages. Each stage is called an instar, and they shed their skin at each stage. And from the time of egg to the time of maturity, their size increases about 1,000-fold. The larval stage may last days, weeks, or months, and in rare cases, even years. And all development occurs at the caterpillar stage. The emerging moths and butterflies are final products. They no longer change. And the lives as caterpillars are typically much longer than their lives as adult moths or butterflies. In fact, the average life of a butterfly is only about 4 weeks. I didn't know that before we did this presentation. So here's the butterfly life cycle. Here you see a butterfly, it lays eggs. Then you get a young caterpillar, gets a little bit bigger, goes through a pupal stage here and here. Remember, it's molting through each of these sections. Down here, it might be in what's called the chrysalis, and then the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis. The cycle for a moth would be very similar. They don't have a chrysalis, but they typically have a cocoon. So again, as I mentioned, the caterpillars go through these 5 stages called instars, and they shed their skin at each stage. So here in this top picture, you see this caterpillar is beginning to shed its skin. Its skin is called integument. So the head is sticking out first. The integument is moving backward as the caterpillar is moving forward. And this bottom one shows the big difference between stages, how much it grows. So here's a caterpillar at probably the second instar stage. Here's one at the 5th instar stage. So you can see really incredible growth over a period of time with each molting that takes place. So again, if there's so many caterpillars, why aren't we seeing them? Well, they're usually very well camouflaged. Some are the same color as their host. Others might look like bark. Others might look like twigs. Some look like leaves. And many are hidden during the day and they're active only at nighttime. So how do we know they're there? Well, the leaves on your trees and bushes and plants may have multiple holes in them. That's a good sign that there have been caterpillars there. And you might even see the birds feeding them to their hatchlings. So again, here's a typical leaf. We don't actually see the caterpillar, but all those holes that are left in this leaf obviously are from caterpillars. And here you have classic example, this bird, this bluebird is feeding its hatchlings a nice, fat, juicy caterpillar. Remember, the caterpillars are soft, They have a high protein content and a high lipid content. So they're really the ideal food for these hatchlings. And in fact, a single chickadee pair will catch 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one brood of chicks. So pretty impressive. It obviously means there are lots of caterpillars out there. So even though we're not seeing them, the birds are able to find them and feed them to their hatchlings. So again, moths and butterflies lay their eggs on leaves, buds, flowers, rocks, twigs, or even on the ground. And the eggs can be laid either singly or in glued together masses up to about 1,000 eggs. And the eggs usually hatch within 2 to 10 days. And then the larvae emerge from the eggs by cutting a hole in the shell or eating the whole shell. They usually feed on the plant on which the eggs were laid. And both the eggs and the slow moving larvae are very vulnerable to many predators. Okay, so who are the predators of the caterpillars? Well, birds, of course, feed the caterpillars to their young. Some mammals may eat the caterpillars. Some big insects might eat the caterpillars. So praying mantis, even some big spiders, some beetles. But the number one predators of caterpillars are actually parasitic wasps and flies. And those parasitic wasps often lay eggs inside the caterpillar. And then the emerging wasp larvae consume the caterpillar from the inside out. Sounds like pretty gruesome. You'll remember in our discussion of the emerald ash borer, one of the potential ways we might be able to fight the emerald ash borer in the future are special wasps that are predator wasps that actually lay eggs inside the emerald ash borer. So, how to kill caterpillars, avoid the birds and the other predators? Well, camouflage certainly helps. They might look like twigs, leaves, barks, or even bird droppings. We'll show you some pictures of those. And some can change size or movements to actually scare off the predators. Others have spots that look like giant eyes of a larger animal to scare away a predator. And some have a false head that they can raise to scare off predators. And a bright color often implies that something is going to taste bad or have a toxic content. Some caterpillars have sharp hairs or spines that actually sting, and some produce chemicals that deter the predators. Some dangle on trees or silk threads in order to avoid predators. And many are protected in silk tents called basically cocoons or in hard structures called chrysalis. And we mentioned before, many are hidden during the day and they're more active at night, and that avoids some predators. And some actually aggregate together in groups to thwart predators. And some have a mutually beneficial relationship with ants. Very interesting. We'll talk about that too in a minute. So this is a Pandora sphinx moth larva, and look at that huge false eye. Okay, so many predators think this is a much larger animal. Here's one that looks like a snake. This is a spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. Certainly looks like a snake, and that may scare away many predators. Here's one that's dangling. You've probably come across these. Sometimes when we're hiking through the forest, we see a little caterpillar that's dangling down on a silk thread. And this caterpillar can actually swing around. Sometimes the wind will blow it and push it to a safer site. And it may also help them reach leaves to eat without having to anchor on those leaves. Okay, and more camouflage. Many are very well camouflaged. This top one actually shows one that looks like a twig. The bottom one actually looks like bird poop. So, so probably not too many predators are going to eat that one. They blend in very well with their surroundings. Here's one that actually blends in well with the bark of a tree. And here's one that's sitting right along the main vein of a leaf. You can barely see that caterpillar. And again, we mentioned before spikes as weapons. This is the Hillary tussock moth caterpillar. And its hairs can irritate the skin of people who are very sensitive to them. And those hairs are barbed and they easily detach, and they can become embedded in the skin, the eyes, or mucous membranes of potential predators. So again, this is a pretty good defense that protects this particular caterpillar from predators. And again, we mentioned before that moth larvae spin silk, and they spin these silk cocoons that will protect them. And again, this is a hickory tussock moth larva that's in a cocoon. And a chrysalis, on the other hand, is a hardened casing that surrounds the pupal stage of butterflies. So here you actually see a monarch butterfly in a chrysalis. Safety in numbers, again, we said some aggregate together in groups to escape predators. And this is a many-banded swallowtail larvae in its final instar stage. And on top of a leaf, it certainly camouflages itself very well. This is a photo from the Book of Caterpillars by D.G. James. We'll talk about that one a little later. And ants sometimes protect caterpillars. Some caterpillars secrete the sugary compound honeydew. We've talked about honeydew in the past, and we'll mention it again a little bit later. The ants love the honeydew. So the physical presence of lots of ants swarming on top of the caterpillars and the honeydew discourage many parasitoids and other predators from actually attacking those caterpillars. And again, caterpillars benefit from ants in another way. We showed this slide once before. The aphids are usually harmful insects, but they secrete honeydew. So because the ants love honeydew, they will actually protect the aphids from predators like ladybugs. But the harvester butterfly larvae, basically the caterpillar of the harvester butterfly, they actually eat the aphids. So it's very interesting relationships that caterpillars have with ants. When we talked about oak trees, we mentioned that oak trees are a keystone species. And that means that they're critical for the ecology of the forest. Without oak trees, we'd have devastation in our ecology. And we ascribe much of the importance of the oak trees to the acorns that they produce, because the acorns are such an essential food for so many different wildlife species. But the oak leaves also feed caterpillars of over 500 species of moths and butterflies. So the oak leaves really are often covered with caterpillars, even though they're pretty hard for us to see. And again, those caterpillars in turn contain the protein and lipids that are critical for the food that birds feed their young and grow. So some might therefore consider the caterpillar to also be a keystone species, because if we didn't have caterpillars, there would be really lasting effects on the ecology of the forest and wildlife. So again, we mentioned before there are 4,000 to 5,000 species of caterpillars here in New Hampshire, and they come in all sizes and shapes. Don't worry, we're not going to show you each of those or the other 160,000 species of caterpillars, but we will show you a few that you're likely to encounter here. Most of you have seen the monarch butterfly. This is the classic pollinator, and it's famous for its long trips to Mexico and back. They're the only butterflies known to make two-way migrations, and its caterpillars feed on milkweed. And you can see the caterpillars and the milkweed on Snow Hill here at Eastman. More on Snow Hill later on. Every year, millions of monarch butterflies head south into Texas, then over the border into Mexico, and they spend the winter in Mexico. And then after a mating frenzy in spring, the butterflies go northward. Many of the males die along the way. The females will lay their eggs on milkweed plants in the southern part of the United States, and then they die. But the new caterpillars hatch, they feed, and they eventually pupate and form new butterflies. So that new generation of adults continues flying north, and the females, once they arrive here in the north, once again lay their eggs on milkweed. And at the end of the summer, the last brood of adult butterflies comes out. And by this time, this is actually the fourth or fifth generation, and they head south to Mexico. So it's an incredible saga. This is a map showing the pattern. Here you can see that butterflies, monarch butterflies from up here in New Hampshire would fly down here. They get down to Mexico. Those from the more central areas also fly down. And this is showing a tree in Mexico where the butterflies, the monarch butterflies, have landed. So again, they typically live in Mexico at pretty high altitudes in some forests that are 8,000 to 12,000 feet high. And those are relatively cool but stable conditions. And they many of them have flown over 2,000 miles over a period of 75 days. They typically fly about 30 miles a day to reach that destination. And the weight of all these monarch butterflies in this tree can actually bend some of the trees that they land on. So it's pretty impressive. Well, monarchs have a clear relationship with milkweed. Milkweed is the sole host plant for the monarchs. Again, the top is showing a monarch butterfly that's on a milkweed plant. Bottom here, this is showing a chrysalis. Remember, this is one of the later stages of pupal development of the monarch. And this is showing a monarch butterfly that's actually emerging from that chrysalis. So again, the caterpillars feed on the milkweed. And this is showing caterpillars, two different instars on a milkweed plant. So here you see a small one. This might be, say, a second instar stage. This would probably be a fifth instar stage. And you can see the caterpillars in the milkweed here on Snow Hill at Eastman. Okay, here's one you don't want to touch. This is the brown moth caterpillar, brown tail moth caterpillar. And you don't want to touch it because it has poisonous fine hairs that can cause a rash like poison ivy. It can also cause some serious respiratory problems. So the round tail moth really wasn't here in New Hampshire for a long time. It just returned for the first time in 75 years, about a year ago. It had previously been mostly confined to Maine, but these poisonous hairs of the caterpillar can cause a rash, looks like poison ivy. And in some people, it can cause serious respiratory problems. And the little hairs they have barbs on them, so they get easily blown in the wind, and they can get into people's lungs or skin, even just from raking leaves in an infested area. So again, it's a pretty serious one. And the primary hosts for the brown-tailed moth are apple and oak trees, and in some coastal shrubs like beech plum or cherry. And the caterpillar stage takes place from August in one year to late June the next year. But the risk of exposure to their hairs is usually greatest between April and July. So right about now is when the risk of exposure to the brown-tailed moth is probably highest. You also want to be careful of this one. We showed this before. This is the hickory tussock moth. And remember, it has these very sharp hairs that can irritate the skin of people who are sensitive to them. And once again, these hairs are barbed, they easily detach, and they can get embedded in your skin, your eyes, or mucous membranes, or the mucous membranes or eyes of other predators. And they spin a cocoon from the plant debris and from their own hairs. And here's the hickory tussock moth. Interestingly, they don't eat. They just mate and reproduce. And it's interesting that there's several other butterflies and moths that actually don't eat. They just mate and reproduce. So the history of tussock moth is common here in the northeastern U.S., and those hairs can irritate the skin. These caterpillars usually appear in the fall, and their hairs are barbed. And as we mentioned, they can become embedded in multiple parts of your body. And those hairs also get incorporated into silk of the cocoon, and that further protects them. And the usual hosts are hickory trees, walnuts, pecan, or American hornbeam. But most hardwood deciduous trees could also be hosts for the hickory tussock moth. And the caterpillars have also been recorded on hops, the Virginia creeper, raspberry, rose, sumac, and blueberry. So we do have some Virginia creeper here at Eastman, and you might find a hickory tussock moth there. The rosy maple moth obviously likes maple trees. Its caterpillar is called the green striped maple worm, and they feed on maples, but it takes actually a large population if they were going to end up defoliating the maple. So usually not too much of a problem. And once again, the adult moth doesn't have a mouth or a digestive system, so it doesn't eat. So it lives actually 2 to 9 months purely on the energy that it got from that caterpillar. Very interesting. The harvester butterfly, this is unique. It's the only caterpillar whose larvae are carnivores. Remember, we showed you a picture of its caterpillar eating aphids. So they eat aphids. And again, we showed this before. This is showing these are aphids that are on the leaf of a plant. The ants were protecting the aphids. The ants love the honeydew that the aphids produce. And here you have a harvester butterfly larva that is going to eat these aphids. So interesting relationship. Luna moths are actually one of the biggest moths in North America. And they have these lime green wings that can be 4.5 to 7 inches wide. They also have these long tails. And its caterpillar is also green. And their hosts are broadleaf trees. So you can see if this was on a fairly broad leaf, it'd be pretty hard to detect. Their larvae don't reach sufficient populations really to do much damage to the trees. Here are two Luna moths that are actually on a grill cover here at Eastman. Uh, but don't blink. The lifespan of the Luna moth is only 2 weeks, so you're unlikely to see them very long. Okay, the woolly bear caterpillar. It's only a myth that the banded woolly bear caterpillar can predict winters. They interesting thing though is they freeze solid during the winter and then they thaw in the spring. Uh, you may remember in some of our other presentations that certain frogs will freeze in the winter. They freeze completely and they actually are in kind of suspended animation through the winter and then they actually thaw in spring and actually are alive in spring. So the same thing happens to the woolly bear caterpillar. And they're covered with these dense, coarse hairs, and eventually they transform into the Isabella tiger moth, which you see down here. The eastern tiger swallowtail caterpillar is this one that almost looks like a snake. It's bright green, it has these two large eye spots on top, and the thorax is much larger than the middle, and the tail makes it kind of look like it has an enlarged head. That may scare off some predators. And the favorite host plants for this species are the tulip tree and the wild black cherry. We do have some black cherry trees here, so you might conceivably see an eastern tiger swallowtail caterpillar. And this is the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly, really a beautiful butterfly. This is the northern pearly-eyed butterfly, and it's a forest dweller. Its caterpillars feed on understory grasses, and interestingly, it may also feed on animal scat or rotting fruit or sap. So it's a little unusual that it feeds on those unusual things. Here's the eight-spotted forester moth. This is actually a moth. This is kind of the exception. Remember we said most moths have very dull wings. Well, this colorful moth actually has very colorful wings. But again, here at rest, you can see that the wings are still folded over the abdomen as opposed to being raised like a butterfly would. So here's the caterpillar down here, and they feed on grape species, and that would include wild grape and Virginia creeper. So again, because we do have some Virginia creeper here, you actually might get to see an eight-spotted forester moth or its caterpillar. And the adults feed on nectar, so they're actually pretty good pollinators. So again, we usually think about butterflies as primary pollinators, but in fact, moths are also pretty good pollinators. Here's the snowberry clearwing moth. And this one is really interesting because it has these clear wings. And quite frankly, many people mistake this for a bee or even a hummingbird. So if you just look at this adult up here, you would say, gee, looks like a bee to me, or even a small hummingbird. And its caterpillars typically feed on honeysuckle. Snowberries are actually a member of the honeysuckle family, so that's where it gets its name from. Here's a black and yellow lichen moth, another beautiful moth that's actually colorful. So again, kind of breaking the rule that most moths have dull wings. This is actually very beautiful. And it tends to feed on goldenrod in late summer. Uh, Remember, goldenrod and some asters are late growing plants, and they're extremely important because, again, they provide some nutrition for various insects beyond the summer months. So it's really very important. And its caterpillars will feed on lichens, and the caterpillars are often camouflaged to look like lichens. Here's a mourning cloak. So the mourning cloak caterpillars are often found in deciduous forests, like ours are mixed forests, and they overwinter as adults, so they emerge fairly early in the spring. And they often precede their usual food, so they end up feeding on things like tree sap or some of last fall's rotten, unclaimed fruit that's begun to thaw. So again, they often live for a full year, which is unusual for uh, most butterflies. So again, this is a photo from Ann Little that appeared in Northern Woodlands. This is the mourning cloak butterfly. Here's the great spangled fritillary butterfly, another beauty. It's named for these sharp-looking metallic-like spots on the undersurface of the wings. And just as milkweeds are required for monarch caterpillars, wild violets are the essential elements for fritillary's reproductive cycle. So it's very interesting. We'll talk about most butterflies or moths have a relationship with one specific plant type. The maple leaf cutter moth, each year we see lots of holes in maple leaves, particularly the sugar maples. And we'll also see these little white spots. So again, not only do you see the holes, you see all these little circular white spots. And the maple leafcutter moth, the larvae cut out these round discs and they fasten them together with silk. So it produces a kind of a protective cage around itself. So here you actually see the larvae in here, and it's encased itself with this little silk coated disc. Very interesting. And this is showing the maple leaf cutter moth. Okay, remember it's a moth. Its wings are held tightly over the abdomen. And again, the bottom is just showing here's a moth within that silk casing, these kind of round circular things that are there. And it provides the leaf provides not only food but protection. The spongy moth, also formerly known as the gypsy moth, can cause incredible devastation to forests. This is one you don't want. So it was formerly known as the gypsy moth. It is an invasive species, has no natural predators here in North America, and it was imported to the U.S. Over 100 years ago for its potential silk production. And it really causes devastating defoliation of forests here in New England. And the spongy moths prefer oak, willow, apple, crabapple, white birch, witch hazel, mountain ash, basswood, linden, pine, Douglas fir, and spruce. So it can affect not just one species of trees, but very many species. But they'll also feed on hardwoods like maple, cherry, walnut, hickory, chestnut, and even trees like hemlock, elm, yellow birch, beech, and a number of other trees. There is a fungus that's been helping to keep the spongy moth in check. So I mentioned they don't really have natural predators here in North America, but this particular fungus may be helpful in keeping them in check. And once again, we've talked before about parasitic wasps, and people are very hopeful that there may be a parasitic wasp that could be developed that would attack the spongy moth caterpillars. So here's the spongy moth caterpillar. And again, it can cause this incredible devastation. So this is showing egg masses that are laid on the side, probably an oak tree here. And the bottom one shows the emerging spongy moth larvae that are coming out of those egg masses. And this is showing all the spongy moth caterpillars that are feeding on the oak leaves. So look at how they've just devastated this oak. And you may actually recognize them, their presence by their droppings. So here are the caterpillars. You may not actually see the caterpillars, but they actually leave these droppings over here. A couple of years ago, we were called over to see if we could identify something on somebody's deck. And in fact, what we saw were all these little things, which in fact are the droppings of the spongy moth. So again, oak is the preferred source for food source for the spongy moth, and even light defoliation of the oaks can substantially reduce the acorn production. So that could have a devastating effect. Remember, we've talked on numerous occasions how important the oaks are to wildlife here in New Hampshire and elsewhere. Many birds and mammals really depend on the acorns. So again, certainly could affect us here at Eastman because without hard mass like acorns out in the forest, the bears turn to food sources that are near humans. So again, the spongy moth could be devastating. Fortunately, we've not really had any significant spongy moth infestations here at Eastman yet, but it's something we're always on the lookout for. And if you want to learn more about the acorns and hard mast, you can go either to our video on oak trees or the one on hard mast. Spotted lanternfly. Okay, I included this here. This is not a butterfly or a moth, but it certainly looks like one. The spotted lanternfly is an invasive species that looks like a butterfly or moth, but it's not a Lepidoptera. It's actually a hopper or plant hopper. And this is showing what it looks like. It has these translucent gray wings that have these black spots. That's why it's called spotted. And again, the hind wings are red and they have patches of black and white. And down here are the nymphs, which look like little beetles. So again, once again, this is not a butterfly or a moth. But again, because it looks like one, I've included it here. And the spotted lanternfly is invasive, and it's not yet been found here in New Hampshire, but it's well established in some neighboring states. And it, like I said, it's not a butterfly or a moth, it's a hopper or a plant hopper. It really doesn't fly very well. And they feed on a wide range of plants. And both the adults and the nymphs suck juices from the plant, and that results in excretion of honeydew. Remember, that's that very sugary, sticky substance that we talked about that aphids produce and some other things produce. And the honeydew gets spread over cars, sidewalks, walls, patio furniture, anything under that feeding site. And it's also very attractive to insects and wasps and yellow jackets. I always tell the story. A few years ago, we were looking at some trees with Dode Gladers, who's the Sullivan County forester. And One of the residents here in Eastman was complaining of this sticky sap that was all over his deck, and he thought it was pine sap. And Dode Gladers happened to notice that there were some yellow jackets there. And he pointed out that yellow jackets in particular are attracted to honeydew. So he suggested that, in fact, this was not pine sap that was all over this deck. It was likely honeydew, and that it was probably not sap coming from the pine trees that were there, but it was probably that there were aphids infesting some of the trees that were near this deck. And that actually was good news for the resident because you can use insecticides against the aphids, whereas you can't do very much about pine sap. So interesting story. And sometimes a mold will also grow on the honeydew. That mold is often kind of a sooty sort of a mold. Okay, well, that gets us back to this concept I mentioned before of coevolution. We also see that, particularly with caterpillars, they often have a host and they grow together. So they've co-evolved. So coevolution is this process where two or more species reciprocally influence each other's evolution over time. And one species evolves in response to the other, and then the other species in turn evolves in response to the first one. So it also is very interesting. That's why some plants that grow very well in other continents uh, become invasive species when they come here to the United States. And that's because in the other continent, they co-evolved with an insect or some other species that basically held it in check. They come over here and they don't have that natural predator species, so they become invasive species here. A couple other related concepts would be mutualism and symbiosis, and that's where two parties tend to be associated with each other. In all these examples, both parties usually benefit from each other. So there are many examples of caterpillars that have special relationships with certain plants. The classic one is monarchs and milkweed. Well, again, monarchs have evolved this unique relationship with milkweed. It's the only plant that monarchs will lay their eggs on and that their caterpillars feed on. And because they interact very closely, it's an evolutionary adaptation where one species acts as a selection pressure on the other. And in all these examples, again, both parties are benefiting from this relationship. The monarchs obviously benefit from feeding on the milkweed, and milkweed in turn benefits from the monarchs pollinating their flowers. So again, this is showing milkweed. I showed this before. Here's a monarch caterpillar on the milkweed plant. Down here, you see the chrysalis. This is the kind of hard case that the last pupal stage of the monarch is in. And here the monarch butterfly is actually emerging from that chrysalis. So again, these are a great example of coevolution. Milkweed has two strong mechanisms that it uses to ward off predators. First of all, it produces a sticky sap that causes the jaws of insects to stick shut, so they can actually eat the leaves of the milkweed. But the monarch caterpillars know how to block the flow of that sticky sap. They actually crawl 2/3 of the way up to from the leaf tip, and they chew through a large midrib at that stage, and that actually blocks the flow of this sticky sap. But the milkweed also produces substances called cardiac glycosides that have a very bitter taste that really deters insects from eating them. And the monarchs have developed enzymes that render those cardiac glycosides less toxic. The monarchs actually have a way of then storing these distasteful compounds in their wings and their blood, and that actually renders them unpalatable to many other predators. So it's very interesting how at each step, when the milkweed develop one mechanism, the monarch develop a counter mechanism. And again, this is showing some milkweed. This is where they lay their eggs. If you want to see milkweed, go to Snow Hill at Eastman. So we're going to talk about Snow Hill. This is Snow Hill at Eastman. This is a former ski hill. There used to be a ski lift up here. That's long been gone. But now you have these basically three old ski runs that go down there. And after they removed the former ski lift, Eastman maintenance would mow all these ski runs, and they would mow from side to side. Well, back in 2015, we had two environmental experts, Matt Tarr and Lionel Shute, who visited us around the time that the town of Grantham was launching a community-wide pollinator program. And they pointed out that the monarch butterflies lay their egg on the milkweed, and then the caterpillars develop on the milkweed, which formerly was very common on Snow Hill. And Tarr and Shute noted that the monarch butterfly life cycle requires adequate nourishment, not only in spring and summer, but also late into fall. So they rely not only on the milkweed, but they also rely on the butterflies would rely on the nectar from goldenrod and fall asters that come later in the year and really help prepare them for their migration to Mexico. And it's not only the monarch butterflies that need those goldenrod and fall asters, because there are other pollinators that need some nourishment from them. But Tarr and Shute noted that if we do complete mowing side to side on those Snow Hill downhill runs, we basically destroy all the caterpillars. And we also prevent those late blooming flowers from growing at the edges. So what they suggested was very interesting. They said we ought to use a modified mowing pattern such that only a third of each slope would be mowed each year. And the mowed zone would shift from year to year. And that would result in about a third being mowed at least once every 3 years. And this would do a number of things. It would preserve a section of for recreation, so people could walk or hike up and down the hill. It would provide a good habitat for the larvae and the caterpillars and the butterflies, and it would allow an increase in the late blooming flowers at the edges. So it really accomplished three things. So the Eastman Charitable Foundation and the Grantham Garden Club gave us some grants to fund the project. And as a result, today the milkweed and the monarchs actually flourish on Snow Hill. So this was a very successful project. And again, like I said, if you want to see monarch caterpillars and milkweed, take a little hike on Snow Hill. So once again, it allowed these really three important things to happen. It provided a section that was still used for recreational climbing. It preserved the habitat for the caterpillars and the butterflies to develop, and it allowed those late blooming flowers to flourish at the edges. Okay, an alarming effect. Over 100 species of butterflies have decreased at least 50% over the last 2 decades. And the total butterfly abundance in the United States has declined 22% across all species over the last 2 decades. And it's obviously part of the bigger decline in insects. I think all of you know that we're seeing a substantial decline in insects, not only in the United States, but really worldwide, probably as a result of mostly climate change, but some is also due to habitat loss or use of pesticides. So what can we do to reverse that trend of declining butterflies and caterpillars? Well, Doug Tallamy, who's a noted ecologist and the author of the book Nature's Best Hope, argues that we should be ditching our lawns for more natural habitats. If you think about it, it's actually on a smaller scale what we did with Snow Hill. Okay, so instead of having a lawn that was manicured and mowed all year long, we decided we need to let things grow there naturally. And Doug Tallamy says the same thing. We need to replace our lawns, let the plants grow, plants that are used by pollinators. Lawns that are well mowed produce less oxygen and use up less carbon dioxide than what they formerly replaced. And watering lawns actually consumes more water than is replaced by rainfall. And the fertilizer that we use on lawns is just as bad as what's used in agriculture. And much of that fertilizer ends up on the surface or in groundwater. And many chemicals that we put in our lawn are actually banned in many other countries as carcinogens. So ditching your lawn is actually the Snow Hill project on a backyard scale. Very interesting. Telemy also points out that weeds are in the eye of the beholder. And he gives an example, goldenrod. Many people consider goldenrod to be a weed, but goldenrod actually supports 110 species of caterpillars and many species of beetles. Its flowers provide pollen and nectar for 35 different bee species and myriads of wasps and beetles. And it provides forest fall nourishment for migrating monarchs. Remember, we mentioned that the monarchs, when they come out, they need a source of energy before they make that long migration to Mexico. So they really need the goldenrod and the asters that come out in the fall because it provides them with nourishment for that long migration. So goldenrod roots are thick and intertwined, and they prevent erosion. They actively build topsoil and encourage rainwater infiltration, and rather than stormwater runoff. So actually, while some people consider them a weed, they're actually very useful. Also, it's very important that we use native plants in our landscapes. And a study compared landscapes that had primarily native plants versus a typical suburban landscape that had lots of non-native ornamental plants. And there were significantly more caterpillars and caterpillar species in the native landscapes. And significantly greater bird abundance and diversity was actually seen in areas where you had native landscapes as opposed to the non-native landscapes. And the bird species of regional conservation concern were actually 8 times more abundant in those native landscapes. So this was a study that was done by Burkhardt and Doug Tallamy and a number of other people almost 2 decades ago. So bottom line on Lepidoptera, the caterpillars, butterflies, and moths are very good for our ecology. We can and should be doing things to encourage them and avoid things that lead to their decline. So if you want to read a couple good references, a book by D.G. James, the Book of Caterpillars will tell you all about the various caterpillars. So if you want to see more of that 160,000 plus species that I showed you, go to that book. And then again, as I mentioned, Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, is a real important book that you ought to read because it tells you a lot about what we should be doing about the landscapes of around our own homes. So once again, that's a little bit about butterflies, caterpillars, and moths, and they're very interesting, very important part of ecology.